Thomas Aldridge was 10 years old, and the sky had come down to the ground. He could not see the fence line, could not see his father's barn 300 yards behind him, or the lamp his father kept burning in the window when nights ran cold. He could not see his own outstretched hand clearly enough to count fingers. There was only white. White from the earth up to his knees. White from his knees up to his face. White in every direction he turned. The wind did not howl. It screamed. He called for his father. The storm swallowed the sound before it traveled 10 feet. He called again. Same result. He was in the open field. He knew that much. He had been walking from Nora Calloway's property back toward home when the sky closed without warning. 20 minutes ago, he could see perfectly. Now he could see nothing. The field was flat and wide and without landmarks. Every direction looked like every other direction. He had been walking for what felt like an hour and had no way to know if he had gone forward or in a circle. His hands had stopped hurting. That was the part that frightened him most. Then his right hand hit something. Not a fence post, not a tree. A rope, taut and steady, anchored to something solid in each direction, running straight through the white blindness, as if the storm had been no part of its plans at all. Thomas Aldridge gripped that rope with both hands and did not let go. He followed it, one end, then the other. That rope had been strung across that field by a woman the entire valley had spent 6 months laughing at. If you are watching this for the first time, I want you to do one thing before we go back to where this story begins. Subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments below. Every week, people from across this country gather here for stories like this one, and it means more than I can say. Stay until the very end, because the rope and the boy in that field are only the last chapter. What comes before it is the reason they matter. Now let's go back to where it all began. The winter that killed Ray Calloway was not the worst winter Montana had ever seen. That was the part that stayed with Nora longest. It was an ordinary January. Cold, yes. Windy, yes. But men had worked ranches through worse and come home for supper. Ray Calloway went out to check on the livestock the morning of January 14th, 1880, and he did not come back. He was found the following afternoon when a neighbor's dog followed the scent through the snow, 40 feet from the barn door. That was the distance between Ray Calloway and the warmth that could have saved him. A whiteout had hit without warning while he was making his way back across the yard. He had walked in a circle in the blinding snow and never found the door. 40 feet. In another life. A length of rope from the barn latch to the house might have brought him home. Nora had walked out to the spot where they found him and stood there for a long time before she turned back. She did not cry that day. She looked at the barn, she looked at the house, she measured the distance between them with her eyes. Then she went inside and started making supper, because Daniel was 6 years old, and children still needed supper when the world had broken. Ray Calloway had learned rope work from a Scottish trapper named Gideon Bell, who had run trap lines in the Rockies for 30 years. 4-strand braid, different from the standard 3, tighter under tension, more flexible in cold. Ray had taught Nora the pattern the first winter of their marriage, sitting beside the stove on a February evening with a length of hemp across his knees. He had worked her hands through the sequence slowly. Cross, tuck, pull, cross, tuck, pull. his hands over hers until her hands knew it without his. "A rope is only as good as where it's tied," he told her that evening. That was Gideon Bell's rule. You tie it to something that doesn't move, and it will hold anything. She still made the same braid. After Ray's death, she had taken a length of that 4-strand cord and tied it around her left wrist. Not as decoration, not as grief theater for the neighbors. She tied it because it was the most honest thing she knew how to carry. When Daniel was old enough to ask about it, she gave him the same answer she would give Clara Aldridge 2 years later, when the girl reached up and touched it with one careful finger. Something to hold on to. Daniel Calloway was 8 years old in the spring of 1882, and he carried his father's absence the way a child carries a stone in a coat pocket. You would not notice it watching him. He worked without complaint. He helped Nora with the animals before school, and ate his supper and said his prayers, and slept without making trouble. But sometimes, when Nora came to check on him at night, his eyes were already open, looking at the ceiling, thinking something he had decided not to say. She understood that she did not press him. The rope idea had lived in her mind since the afternoon she stood 40 feet from her own barn in the snow. It had taken her 2 full years to gather the materials, the posts, and enough clear days between the 100 other tasks a woman alone with 40 acres could not set aside. By early April of 1882, she was ready. She started between the house and the barn. That was the most important distance. She drove the anchor post into the softening ground at each end, ran the line at waist height, tested its tension. Then she moved to the barn and the well and the root cellar, the cellar and the woodshed and the back door. By the end of the second week, a grid of rope connected every structure on the Calloway property. Daniel walked the lines the first morning they were all in place. He ran his hand along each one, testing the tension the way his father used to test fence wire, pressing his thumb against the cord and feeling for slack. He said nothing when he came back inside, but at supper that night he sat a little straighter in his chair, and Nora noticed. She did not say anything about it. Some things were better left to settle on their own. The neighbors noticed within a week. The first comment came from Harlan Webb, who ran cattle on the property to the east and had made it his habit to have an opinion on everything within eyeshot of his fence line. He told 3 people at the feed store that Nora Calloway had strung up enough rope to hang every man in the county, and that he could not decide if she was preparing for winter or losing her mind. The feed store passed it along to the church, and the church passed it along to Margaret Hale, which was how most things of interest traveled across Garfield County in the spring of 1882. Margaret Hale had been a widow for 4 years and had spent those 4 years managing her late husband's supply business with an iron grip and a gracious smile. She was the kind of woman who attended every funeral, organized every church supper, and remembered every outstanding debt without ever writing it down. The Valley's social calendar moved around her approval the way wagon wheels moved around a deep rut out of habit, and always in the same direction. She rode past the Calloway property on a Thursday morning and slowed her horse to a full stop at the fence line. She looked at the ropes for a long moment, studied them the way a woman studies something she has already decided about but wants to appear to be considering. Then she said, to no one in particular, "The rope woman." It was not intended as cruelty, or perhaps it was. With Margaret Hale, the distance between those 2 things was rarely more than a raised eyebrow. The name spread quickly. By Sunday, it had reached the church steps. By the following Wednesday, it had made the trading post. Children repeated it, because children repeat what they hear adults say. And by the middle of May, even Daniel had heard it said in front of him at the schoolhouse. He came home that afternoon and stood in the yard, looking at the lines his mother had strung between the barn and the well. He did not say anything. Nora did not say anything either. She was tying off a new section near the woodshed, and she kept working. That was all. Sheriff Amos Pratt rode up the following afternoon. Pratt was a fair man. 9 years in the job had made him deliberate rather than quick, and he had earned the valley's trust the hard way, one difficult decision at a time. He dismounted carefully, the way a man does when he is not sure how a conversation is going to land. He looked at the rope grid without speaking for a moment. Nora. He took his hat off. I have to say something I'd rather not have to say. Go ahead, Amos. He gestured along the nearest line. Those ropes, they're a hazard. Horse spooks in the dark, hits a line it can't see. He let the sentence finish itself. A man crossing your yard in the middle of the night catches one at chest height. He goes down hard. He looked at her steadily. I'm not saying you don't have the right. I'm saying there are ways this ends badly. Nora pressed another stake into the ground before answering. Ray walked 40 feet in a whiteout and didn't find the barn door. Pratt was quiet for a moment. I know that. These run waist height, she said. A horse can step over. A man can see them in daylight. She looked at the line she had just tensioned. In a whiteout, he can follow them home. She paused. A rope is only as good as where it's tied. These are tied to something that doesn't move. Pratt turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the cord, looked at the anchor posts driven deep into the ground at each end. The argument was not unreasonable. He had expected bluster or defensiveness, and she had given him neither, just the work and the facts underneath it. He put his hat back on. Watch the east line near Webb's fence. His cattle lean on that fencing. I will. Thank you. Amos. She did not explain further. The conversation ended there, the way most conversations with Nora Calloway ended, with her hand still moving and the silence standing in for everything else she might have said. She did not explain. Jesse Aldridge had not intended to stop. He had been riding the north road toward the trading post when he caught movement through the trees along the creek bed, a woman driving a stake into the ground with the steady, economical swing of someone who had done it 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more. He pulled his horse up without thinking about it. Jesse Aldridge was not a man who paused to observe other people's business. He had enough of his own. 3,000 head of cattle, 2 children, a foreman who had been asking him to hire a cook for the better part of 8 months, and a grief that sat in his chest like a stone. He had learned to work around rather than move. Agnes had been gone for 3 years. He did not talk about it. He worked around it the same way the creek worked around the boulders in its bed, without appearing to notice them, without ever forgetting they were there. He sat on his horse and watched Nora Calloway drive the next stake, run her line, test its tension, and move to the next point. He watched the efficiency of it, the deliberateness. There was no wasted motion. Every step had already been thought through before she took it. He had been on this road when Pratt rode away from her property earlier, and he had seen enough of the conversation from a distance to understand what it had been about. He watched a while longer. Then he touched his hat brim, though she was not looking at him, and continued on toward the trading post. At supper that night, Clara asked him if he had seen the rope lady's farm. He said he had passed by it. Clara stirred her beans with careful attention. "Why does she put ropes everywhere?" Jessie looked at his plate. "So she can find her way." Clara thought about this for a moment. "That seems smart." Jessie said nothing. He ate his supper, but that night, after the children were in bed and Hector had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had gone quiet, Jessie Aldridge stood at the north window for a long time. Somewhere across the dark field, a line of rope ran between a woodshed and a back door on the Calloway property. He could not see it from here. He knew it was there. He knew exactly how far 40 feet could be in a whiteout. Agnes had died in a bed, in a room, with a doctor present and a lamp burning. There was no rope in the world that would have changed that. But he understood the other kind of distance, the kind so small it made no sense that it hadn't been closed. He understood what a man thought about afterward, standing in the yard in the cold, measuring what 40 feet had cost. He turned away from the window. He did not go back to it that night, but across the valley, in the warm back office of the Hale Supply House, Margaret Hale was adding a 14th name to a petition she had been circulating for 2 weeks. The petition requested that Nora Calloway be required to remove all rope lines from her property within 30 days on grounds of public safety. She read the names over once, folded the paper, and set it beside the lamp. 14 was not enough. She wanted 20 before she brought it to the council. She already knew who the remaining names would be. She had, as always, planned several steps ahead. What she had not planned for, what she could not have planned for, was the winter that was already gathering beyond the northern mountains, moving south at a pace that would make every name on that list irrelevant. But that was still months away, and there was a great deal of damage to be done before then. Summer came to Garfield County the way it always did, suddenly and without apology. The snow retreated to the high ridges. The creek ran fast and brown for 3 weeks, then cleared. Meadow grass rose knee-high along the lower fields, and the rope lines on the Calloway property disappeared into it until they looked from the road like something that had always been part of the landscape. Thomas Aldridge found Daniel Calloway at the fishing hole below the creek bend on the last day of June. Daniel had been there since early morning, a cane pole across his knee and a tin can of worms beside him, doing the particular nothing that boys do when they are waiting for a fish and have given up expecting one. Thomas came down the bank at speed, slid in the mud, caught himself on a willow branch, and sat down 2 feet away without being invited. Daniel looked at him sideways. Thomas looked at the water. "Any luck?" "Not yet." Thomas settled his elbows on his knees. "My pa says you have to stay still." Daniel said nothing. Thomas stayed still for approximately 45 seconds. Then he said, "Your ma's the rope lady, right." The cane pole dipped. Daniel pulled it up, nothing on the hook. He reset the line before answering. "Her name's Nora Calloway." Thomas considered this. "Clara says the ropes are smart." He paused. "I think so, too." He glanced sideways again. "Don't tell anyone I said that." Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he shifted over on the bank and made room. They fished until mid-afternoon and came home with 6 between them. Thomas stayed for supper. He sat across from Daniel and watched Nora move between the stove and the table without making any particular fuss about it. And he ate 2 helpings of the cornbread without being asked if he wanted more, because it was simply placed in front of him when the first piece was gone. He came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. By the middle of July, Thomas Aldridge was a reliable fixture at the Calloway supper table 3 evenings a week, and Clara had decided to accompany him twice a week because, as she explained to Hector, the rope lady's cornbread was better than anything Hector had ever made in his life. And Hector should not feel bad about it, because it was simply the truth. Hector told Jessie about the cornbread. Jessie rode over on a Thursday to collect his children and ended up standing in the yard for 20 minutes because Clara was not ready to leave and had apparently negotiated for 1 more piece of cornbread as a condition of departure. He stood near the gate and waited, turning his hat in his hands. Nora came out to refill the water bucket from the well. She did not appear startled to find him there. She drew the water and set the bucket down and looked at the rope line running from the well to the root cellar. There was a section near the second post where the cord had developed a slow twist, losing some of its tension over the summer ground shift. She went to work on it without a word. Jessie watched her hands on the cord. She was working the 4-strand braid, the tight cross-tuck pattern he had seen once in a trapping manual years ago, used for pack lines in high country because it held its tension under cold contraction, where 3-strand loosened. "You use the bell braid," he said. Nora's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then kept moving. "My husband's work. He learned it from the man himself." Jessie was quiet. Gideon Bell ran his last trap lines in the Absarokas before I was 12. He looked at the cord. My father traded with him twice, said there was nobody in the territory who understood rope the way that man did. Nora finished the adjustment and stepped back to test the tension. He taught Ray that a rope is only as good as where it's tied. She pressed her thumb against the cord. It held clean and straight. She looked at Jessie. He was right. Jessie looked at the line for a moment. Then, without asking, he moved to the next post along and began checking the tension there. He worked his hands along the cord the way a man works a fence wire, feeling for the place where it had gone wrong. He found it, unwound the slack, rebalanced the line. They worked the perimeter in silence for the better part of an hour. Clara came out twice to narrate her progress through the remaining cornbread. Daniel and Thomas appeared at the barn door and decided, collectively, that adults working in silence was less interesting than the barn cat, and retreated. When the last line had been checked, Jessie put his hat back on. "Good system," he said. That was all. She did not explain it to him. She did not thank him at length. She picked up the water bucket and went back inside. Jessie stood in the yard for a moment longer. Then he called the children and went home. He did not mention the rope lines at supper. He did not mention the bell braid, or the anchor posts, or the hour he had spent checking tension in a widow woman's yard. But after the children were in bed, Hector found him at the kitchen table with a length of spare cord and his hands working through a 4-strand cross. Slowly, getting the sequence right, Hector poured himself a coffee and sat down across from him and said nothing. That was how it was between them. Hector Vega had been foreman on the Aldridge Ranch for 11 years, which meant he had been there when Jessie married Agnes Whitmore in the summer of 1871, and he had been there on the February morning 3 years ago when she did not wake up, and he had watched every day in between, and every day since. He did not need to fill silence with words. He had learned long ago that Jessie said the important things, eventually, and that pushing him toward them only drove them deeper. But it was Hector who had been asking for 8 months about the cook, and it was Hector who said, carefully, on the last evening of August, when Nora Calloway had been to the ranch 3 times to return borrowed tools, and Jessie had been to the Calloway property 4 times on errands that seemed to take longer than errands needed to take. She's good with the children. Jessie kept his eyes on the paperwork in front of him. She is... Thomas hasn't woken up from a bad dream in 6 weeks. Hector turned his coffee cup in his hands. Clara asked me yesterday if Miss Nora could braid her hair on Sundays. Jessie said nothing. Hector looked out the window. Miss Agnes has been gone 3 years. Jessie. The room was very quiet for a moment. I know how long she's been gone, Jessie said. His voice was even. Not hard, just even, the way a man keeps his voice when he is keeping it by deliberate effort. Hector nodded once. That was all. He did not push further. He stood and took his cup to the basin and went to the door. He paused there. Ray Calloway died 40 feet from his own barn, he said quietly, and she spent 2 years figuring out how to make sure nobody else did. He opened the door. There's a kind of person who does that, and there's every other kind. He went out without looking back. Jessie did not move for a long time. He had heard the story of Ray Calloway's death, the way everyone in the county had heard it at the feed store, second-hand, the winter after it happened. A trapper. A whiteout. 40 feet. The kind of story men repeated not because it was unusual, but because it was not. Because that was the particular cruelty of this country, that a man could be taken by something as ordinary as distance and darkness, and a wind that came down from the north without warning. He had heard the story. He had not thought about Nora Calloway standing in that yard the following afternoon, measuring the distance with her eyes. He had not thought about 2 years of waiting for clear days between the 100 other tasks. 2 years of gathering materials. 2 years of carrying the idea in her mind the way she carried the cord on her wrist. Quietly, without asking anyone's permission, without announcing it to the people who would have told her it was unnecessary. She did not explain. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She had driven those posts into the ground and strung those lines across every corner of her property, and not one single time had she stood in the road and told anyone why she had let the work be its own answer. She had let the valley laugh and waited for the winter to settle it. Jessie understood that kind of patience. He did not have it himself, but he recognized it, the way you recognize a quality in someone else that you have only ever seen at a distance and always admired from there. Jessie sat at the table for a long time after that. The cord was still in his hands. He had gotten the 4-strand sequence right an hour ago. He kept working it anyway. September came in cool and dry. The rope lines on the Calloway property caught the morning frost and held it. Each cord outlined white against the dark air before the sun rose high enough to take it. From the road they looked, those mornings, like something deliberate, like a map of everywhere a person needed to go. Clara Aldridge had taken to arriving on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, while Thomas was at the barn with Daniel, and Hector was handling the evening feed. She was 7 years old, and she had decided that Nora Calloway required her company specifically, a conclusion she had reached on her own and announced without asking anyone's permission. On a Tuesday in the third week of September, Clara sat at the work table while Nora was mending harness leather, and she reached across and touched the cord around Nora's left wrist with one careful finger. "What is it?" Nora looked down at her wrist. "Something to hold on to." Clara thought about this seriously, the way she considered most things. She traced the braid with her fingertip. 1, 2, 3, 4 strands. "Who taught you?" "My husband." Clara looked up. "Do you miss him?" "Every day." Clara nodded, as though this was the right answer. "My papa misses my mama every day, too." She dropped her hand back to her lap. "He doesn't say so, but he does, I can tell, because he still keeps her cup on the shelf, even though nobody uses it." She picked up the corner of the harness leather and turned it over in her hands. "If you miss people, you should probably say so." She looked at Nora with the particular directness of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned that some truths are impolite. "Don't you think Nora was quiet for a moment?" She kept her hands moving on the leather. "I think you're probably right." "Clara." Clara nodded with satisfaction. Then she was quiet for a while, turning the buckle over in her hands. And the room settled into the particular comfort that comes when two people have said the important thing and can rest now. After a moment, Clara looked up again. "Does it help?" "The cord on your wrist." Nora looked at it. Her thumb moved across the 4-strand braid. "It reminds me that things can hold," she said quietly, "even when the weather is bad, even when you can't see where you're going." She looked at Clara. "It reminds me of that." Clara thought about this for a long time. Then she went back to examining the harness buckle. Nora looked at the cord around her wrist for a moment before she looked away. Margaret Hale came to Jesse Aldridge's ranch on the second Saturday of October. She arrived in a good coat and a careful smile, and she sat in the front room and accepted the coffee Hector brought and placed a folded document on the top table between them. Jesse looked at it without picking it up. "It is a petition," Margaret said pleasantly, "for the safety of the community." She folded her gloved hands in her lap. "The ropes on the Calloway property are a documented hazard. Sheriff Pratt has said so himself. We are asking the county council to require their removal before the winter season." She smiled. 22 names. Jesse. Good names. Reasonable men who care about this valley. Jesse looked at the folded document. He did not touch it. "There is a pen in the desk drawer," Margaret said gently. Jesse looked at her. "Who else have you spoken to about this?" "Most of the valley." She kept her voice warm. "You're among the last." She tilted her head slightly. "Your children spend a great deal of time on that property. You must have concerns of your own." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down again. "Nora Calloway's ropes haven't harmed anyone." "Not yet." Margaret's smile did not change. "But preventable accidents are called that for a reason. Don't you think Jesse looked at the petition?" Then at Margaret. Then he stood up. "I appreciate you coming out, Margaret." She looked at the unsigned document. Jesse, safe ride back. He moved to the door and held it open. Margaret Hale stood slowly, folded the petition, and put it in her coat pocket. Her smile thinned at the edges before she recovered it. She walked to the door and paused at the threshold. "I will need an answer before the council meeting," she said quietly. "One way or another. You have it." Jesse said. She rode away down the valley road. Jesse stood at the door and watched until she was out of sight. Then he went back inside. Hector was at the kitchen table, demonstrating an elaborate lack of interest in the conversation that had just taken place. Jessie sat down across from him. Margaret Hale wants to tear out Nora Calloway's ropes before winter. Hector turned his coffee cup in his hands, and Jessie was quiet for a long moment. "And I didn't sign her petition." Hector said nothing, but something in his posture shifted. Not much, just the small adjustment of a man who has been waiting for something and has just heard it arrive. Jessie picked up the length of cord from the table. He worked the 4-strand braid in silence. Cross, tuck, pull, until his hands had the tension right. Outside the window, the first leaves had come down from the high country. The ridgeline to the north had gone white overnight. Winter was not coming. Winter had already decided to come, and was simply finishing its preparations on its own schedule, without consulting anyone in the valley below. Margaret Hale's petition had 22 names on it. Jessie Aldridge's name was not one of them. That absence would mean nothing to anyone until the snow arrived to explain it. The petition was read aloud on a Sunday. Margaret Hale had chosen the timing with precision. After the closing hymn, before the congregation had fully separated into its smaller conversations. That narrow window when everyone was still gathered and the goodwill of the service still held the room together and made dissent feel like poor manners. She stood at the front of the room and unfolded the document with gloved hands. She read the names first, all 22 of them, slowly, so that each one landed. Harlan Webb, Edmund Foss, the Bremer brothers, the county surveyor, 2 men from the lending office in town. Names the valley recognized, names attached to land and credit and influence. She read them the way a lawyer reads evidence, not with venom, but with the quiet authority of accumulated fact. Nora Calloway sat in the middle pew. Daniel was beside her. He had his hands flat on his knees the way he always sat in church, still and correct, and he did not look up when he heard his mother's name. Nora looked straight ahead. Margaret finished the names and summarized the petition in 3 sentences. The rope lines on the Calloway property constituted a documented hazard. Sheriff Pratt had on record acknowledged their danger. The county council was being asked to require their removal within 30 days for the safety of the community's riders and livestock. She refolded the paper with the same careful precision she had used to open it. She looked at the congregation. She did not look at Jessie Aldridge, who was standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands. But the omission was its own kind of statement. She had announced his absence from the list without announcing it. The room was very quiet. Nora Calloway stood up, not quickly, not dramatically. She stood the way a person stands at the end of a church service, collecting herself, straightening her coat, taking Daniel's hand. She moved toward the aisle. She did not look at the 22 names. She did not look at Margaret Hale. She walked to the door with Daniel beside her, and she pushed it open, and she went out into the cold November light. She did not explain. Jessie watched her go. He looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at Margaret Hale, who had turned to speak to Edmund Foss with the placid expression of a woman who has accomplished what she came to accomplish. He put his hat on. He did not follow Nora. That was the truth of it. And it was a truth he would carry with him for a long time afterward. He had not signed the petition, but he had stood in the back of a room and held his hat in his hands and said nothing, while her name was read aloud in front of everyone. She knew. He went out the side door and collected his children and rode home in silence. Clara asked him twice what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. She looked at him with the focused skepticism of a 7-year-old who has been lied to about adult emotions before and knows exactly what it looks and sounds like. She did not press him further. At the ranch, she went to her room without being asked, which was the thing she did when the world had been unfair, and she was sorting out exactly how unfair it had been. Nora began taking the ropes down the following morning. She started at the woodshed, which was where she had finished stringing them in the spring. Working backward along the sequence, the way you unspool a thing you built with care. She cut the cord at the anchor posts and wound each length into a coil, setting them aside. The ground had not frozen hard yet. The posts came out with some effort. She stacked them along the fence line. Daniel watched from the porch for a while. Then he came out and began pulling the smaller stakes without being asked. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They worked in the same silence they had learned to share after his father died. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who understand that some things require working through rather than talking through. By midday, the line between the woodshed and the back door was gone. The line between the house and the root cellar was gone. The yard looked opened up and ordinary in a way that felt wrong. The way a room looks wrong when you have moved the furniture and the light falls on unfamiliar walls. Nora wound the last coil, set it on the stack. She stood in the yard and looked at the barn. One line remained. The barn to the house. The one she had strung first. The one that had existed in her mind since the afternoon she stood 40 feet from that barn door and looked at the distance that had killed Ray. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside and made lunch because Daniel still needed lunch. She did not take down the barn line that day. Jesse Aldridge came to the Calloway property on Tuesday afternoon. He did not send word ahead. He rode up the track and dismounted at the gate and stood there a moment, reading what had changed. The yard was different. The rope grid was mostly gone. He could see the empty anchor holes along the fence line where the posts had been pulled. The barn line was still there. He looked at it once and then looked away. Nora came out of the house with a bucket. Jesse stood at the gate. He turned his hat in his hands. That was a habit of his, she had noticed, when he was about to say something that cost him something. His hands worked the hat brim as though the words were stored there and had to be worked loose. Nora, he stopped, started again. I stood in the back of that room and I didn't say a word. He looked at her directly. I should have said something. Nora looked at him for a moment. She set the bucket down. It was your choice to make, she said. It was the wrong choice. The yard was quiet. A crow crossed above the barn. Somewhere in the pasture, one of her sheep called twice and went still. Jesse looked at the half-dismantled fence line, the empty holes in the cold ground. He looked at the one remaining rope between the barn and the house. Don't take that one down, he said. She looked at him. His jaw tightened slightly. I know what 40 feet looks like, Nora. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the rope line. At the anchor post she had driven into the ground in April, the one she had come out to test every week through the summer, the one Daniel had run his hand along on the first morning. All the lines were complete. I'm taking them down. Jessie, she said it without anger, just the flat weight of it. The council will require it regardless. Better to do it myself. Jessie looked at the ground, then back at her. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. She took it, unfolded it, read it slowly. It was addressed to the county council in his handwriting. Neat, deliberate, unhurried letters that looked like the man who wrote them. It stated that he, Jesse Aldridge, formally opposed the petition requiring removal of safety lines on the Calloway property, that he had inspected the lines himself and found them adequately constructed and appropriately positioned, that the petition had been circulated without full consideration of the reasons for their installation, and that he requested the council delay any action until the matter could be discussed properly at the winter session. Nora read it twice. She folded it back along its creases and held it out to him. Jesse did not take it. "You keep it." She looked at him. "This won't be enough to stop it." "No," he said. "Probably not." He put his hat back on. "But it's where I stand." He mounted and rode back down the track without looking back. Nora stood in the yard, holding the folded letter. She looked at the empty holes where the posts had been, at the single remaining line still running from the barn door to the house. She put the letter in her coat pocket. She did not put the rope coils back up that afternoon. But she did not take down the barn line either. The storm came on a Wednesday, November 19th. The morning had been still and cold, with a sky the color of old pewter that pressed low over the ridgeline. Hector had looked at it twice over his coffee and said nothing. The horses were restless in the paddock. Nora's dog sat at the front window and would not leave it. By 10 in the morning, Thomas and Daniel had finished their chores and were in the field between the two properties, that wide, flat ground where they had taken to playing out long private dramas involving sticks and imaginary cavalry that no adult had ever been fully briefed on. The field was familiar ground. They had covered it 100 times. In clear weather, you could see both homesteads from the middle of it, Nora's barn to the south and the Aldridge fence line to the north, and the distance between them was nothing. The first gust came through at 10:30. It was not a gust. It was a wall. The temperature dropped 9 degrees in 20 minutes. The sky came apart. What had been a low gray ceiling became a driving white blindness that arrived from the north and wiped out the horizon in seconds. Nora was at the woodshed when it hit, and she pressed herself against the wall and pulled her coat closed and understood immediately what this was and what it meant. "Daniel!" She moved toward the barn without thinking, reached the rope line between the barn and the house and gripped it and followed it to the barn door and got inside. She called Daniel's name. No answer. She called again. The wind screamed over the roof, and her voice went nowhere. She gripped the barn door frame and looked out into the white nothing. The field was gone. The fence line was gone. Everything beyond 15 feet was erased. She went back into the barn and found the extra rope coiled on the top shelf where she kept it, and she tied one end to the barn post and the other around her own waist and went back out into the storm. In the white field, Thomas Aldridge could not hear anything. He had called for Daniel twice when the storm hit and gotten nothing back. He had turned north toward home and walked what felt like the right direction for several minutes and found nothing. No fence line, no barn, no lamp, no sound that was not the wind. He turned again. Every direction was the same direction. The cold had moved inside his coat before he had understood it was doing so, and his hands had gone from hurting to not hurting, which he understood dimly was the more dangerous of the two conditions. He was not panicking. That was the strange part. He was very calm in the way a person gets calm when they have run through all the available options and found that none of them are options. He stopped walking. He stood still in the white field and thought about what he knew. He knew he had been moving south when the storm hit. South was toward the Calloway property. He had been closer to Nora's barn than to his own when the sky came down. He turned himself south again, or what he believed was south, and he took 3 steps. His right hand hit something, not a post, not a tree, a rope, running taut and straight through the blindness in both directions, anchored to something solid at each end. Thomas stood still for 1 full second. He understood what it was. He understood where it went. He gripped it with both hands, one end, then the other. His father had said that once, about a different rope, in a different context. And Thomas had not known until this moment that he had stored the phrase somewhere he could reach it when he needed it. He chose the end that went south. He put his left hand forward on the rope, then his right, then his left again, and he walked. The barn door appeared out of the white like something arriving from another world. It was not locked. He pushed it open and fell inside and lay on the straw floor in the warmth and the dark for a moment, breathing, before he had the strength to call out, "Nora!" He called it louder. "Nora!" Outside the barn, 10 feet from the door, moving along her own rope with both hands. Nora Calloway heard her name through the wind. She found the boy on the floor of her barn, alive, with a cold still in his hands and the rope still in his grip. She pulled him against her and held him. He was shaking. She was shaking. The storm pressed the barn walls from every side. One end, then the other, Thomas said into her coat. That's what I did. One end, then the other. She held on tighter. "Daniel," she said. "Where is Daniel?" Thomas looked up. He was ahead of me. He went north. He paused, toward home. Nora looked at the barn door, at the white wall beyond it. She looked at the rope she had tied to the post and around her own waist. She looked at Thomas. "Stay here," she told him. "Do not move from this spot." She went back out into the storm. Daniel Calloway had done the right thing. When the storm hit, he had turned north the way his mother had told him to turn if he was ever caught in the open field. North meant the Aldridge fence line. The Aldridge fence line meant the barn. He had kept moving north with both arms out and his face down against the wind, and he had found the fence wire after 4 minutes that felt like 40, and he had followed it with his hands all the way to the paddock gate. Hector found him in the barn. The boy was sitting in the corner stall with his knees pulled to his chest and the horses moving uneasily on both sides of him. He was cold through, but whole Hector wrapped him in the saddle blanket from the rail and held him there for a moment, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say yet. Then Daniel looked up. "Thomas," he said. Hector looked at the barn door, at the storm outside. He counted the seconds between what he knew and what he needed to do with it. Where was he when it hit? "Behind me," Daniel said. "He was behind me." Hector stood. He went to the door. He looked at the white wall beyond the paddock and thought about the field between the 2 properties. Flat ground, no fence running through the middle of it. A boy who had turned north toward home, and a boy who had been south of him when the sky came down. He went back to the corner stall and looked at Daniel. "You stay here," he said. "I mean it. Don't move. He went to the house for Jesse. Jesse had been at the kitchen table when the storm hit, and he had been at the kitchen table for 2 hours since, doing exactly what a man does when the world outside has become impassable and his children are somewhere in it. He had gone to the barn once, found it empty, come back inside, gone to the barn again, come back inside. Hector had told him to stay. He had stayed because Hector was right, and because the alternative, going into a whiteout without a rope, without a line, without anything to hold, was how a man added his own name to a list of people who had not come home. He knew that he sat at the table and knew it with every minute that passed. When Hector came through the door, Jesse was already standing. Daniel's in the barn. He's all right. Jesse's eyes moved to the door. And Thomas. Hector met his gaze. We don't know yet. The silence lasted 1 second. He was south when it hit. Hector said carefully, he might have turned toward the Calloway property. Jesse looked at the window, at the white nothing pressed against the glass. She has a rope, he said. His voice was very quiet. Between the barn and the house. Hector nodded once. Jesse looked at the window a moment longer. Then he went to the door and took his coat from the hook and put it on. He took the length of spare rope from the shelf beside the door, the 4-strand braid he had been working through the evenings for 2 months now, and tied one end to the porch post and the other around his own waist. Hector looked at the knot. Jesse, I know where the fence line is, Jesse said. I'll follow it east. Hector put his coat on. They went out together into the white. Jesse found the fence line in 40 seconds. He followed it east with one hand on the wire. Hector, 3 feet behind him. The rope from the porch playing out behind them both. The wind screamed off the ridgeline and drove the snow sideways and made the air solid and white and without depth. Jesse kept moving. 1 post, then the next. East toward the property line. East toward the flat field beyond. He reached the corner post and stopped. Beyond the fence, the field opened up. No wire to follow, nothing to hold. He stood at the post and looked into the white and understood exactly what he was looking at. The same 40 feet that had taken Ray Calloway, multiplied by 100. He called Thomas's name. The wind took it. He called again. Then, from the south, muffled but unmistakable, he heard a door. He moved toward it without thinking, counting his steps, keeping the fence post in his mind as the fixed point behind him, measuring the distance he was creating between himself and the last thing he knew. 10 steps. 20. The rope at his waist ran taut behind him. He called again. A light appeared, not a lamp. The door of Nora's barn open, the interior warmth making it marginally brighter than the white surrounding it. A figure in the doorway. 2 figures. Jesse covered the remaining distance in seconds. Nora was standing in the barn doorway with her hand on the frame, and Thomas was behind her, wrapped in a horse blanket, standing upright, whole and unhurt. Jesse reached the door and looked at his son, and then looked at Nora, and then looked at his son again. Thomas walked into him. Jesse gripped the back of his son's coat with both hands and stood there. He did not speak for a long moment. Nora stepped back to give them the doorway. She looked out at the storm, still running hard across the open field. Daniel went north, Thomas said into his father's shoulder. He went north when it hit. He knows to follow the fence. Jesse looked at Nora over his son's head. Hector found him, Nora said. I sent word through the rope line. She stopped. She looked at what she had just said, and something crossed her face for a moment before it settled. Hector knows the property. He would have looked in the barn first. Jesse kept one hand on Thomas's shoulder. He looked at Nora, at the barn around her, at the rope she had tied around her own waist, now coiled on the post where she had fastened it to come back for his son. The storm ran for another 6 hours. They waited it out in the barn. Jesse, Thomas, Nora, and eventually Daniel, who arrived with Hector an hour later, both of them following Jesse's rope line from the fence post in reverse. Daniel walked through the barn door and went directly to his mother and stood there while she held him, and did not say anything because he was 8 years old, and the only language he had for this moment was the one that did not use words. The horses settled. The wind outside slowly lost its edge. Someone made coffee on the small barn stove. It was Nora, because that was what she did, and because the children needed something warm in their hands, and because sometimes the most useful response to a terrifying thing is a small, practical act that returns the body to its own normal. They sat on the hay bales and drank coffee, all 5 of them, while the storm went quiet. Outside, the wind still pressed against the walls. Inside, the barn held. The horses had stopped moving. The lamp on the post threw a circle of amber light across the straw, and in that light 5 people sat with their hands wrapped around tin cups and said very little, because very little needed to be said. Daniel had not let go of Nora's coat since he came through the door. He sat beside her with his shoulder pressed against hers, not speaking, just present. And she kept one hand on his back, the way she had kept it on his back through every hard thing since his father did not come home. Thomas sat across from them. He was looking at his own hands, which had gotten their feeling back and were now simply hands again, ordinary and warm. He turned them over once and looked at his palms. He looked at Nora. I thought about the rope when I hit it, he said. I knew what it was right away. He paused. I knew it went somewhere. Nora looked at him. Your father told you once, she said. One end, then the other. Thomas nodded slowly. He did. He looked down at his cup. I didn't know I remembered it until I needed it. The barn was quiet for a moment. Jesse was watching his son from across the circle of lamplight. There was something in his face that Nora had not seen there before. Not relief exactly, or not only that. Something that had to do with the difference between the things you build and the things you are simply given. And the moment you understand, you cannot always tell which is which until the weather arrives to show you. He looked at Nora. She met his eyes. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind shifted to a lower register. The storm was spending itself at last, losing ground against the dark and the cold, and the dawn that was still hours away but coming. The lamp burned on. The morning after the blizzard, the valley dug itself out. Drifts had piled chest-high against north-facing walls. Fence lines had disappeared. The road into town was impassable until Harlan Webb's boys worked it for 3 hours with shovels. By mid-morning, people were moving between properties again, comparing damage, checking on neighbors, tallying what had been lost. Jesse Aldridge rode into town at noon. The petition was still posted on the general store door, where Margaret Hale had nailed it the week prior. the county council meeting being scheduled for the following Friday. 22 names. Jesse read them once, standing in the cold with his horse behind him and the valley digging itself out all around him. He had ridden past 3 properties on the way in. At each one, men were working in the snow, clearing doorways, checking livestock, hauling feed to animals that had spent 2 days pressed against the leeward side of a barn. Good men, reasonable men, most of them. Men who had signed their names to a document because a woman with a gracious smile and a supply ledger had asked them to, and because the argument had sounded reasonable at the time, and because nobody in Garfield County in the autumn of 1882 had yet known what a rope strung across an open field was worth.